Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Zevachim Daf Mem Daled. I'll remind you all that the Tani challenge is starting tomorrow. So if you have more people to send it to, recommend that they learn Masechet Ta'anit. It's a great way to get someone excited about learning Gemara and potentially want to be looking for more opportunities. So please send around our stuff. If you're looking for publicity materials for it, you can write to us at info@hadran.org.il and we'll send it to you. Okay, we're going to get started right now with where we ended yesterday, and we're going to kind of start. I always complicate it more when it's at the end of the daf. Now we're starting our daf, so we're going to start with some good background that's going to help us. So for this, I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to look at the study guide. Okay, so here's our study guide. And 1 second, let me just hide this. Okay. So we had this braita. Okay, let's just remember how we started. We went into this braita that we had quoted one line of for some purpose. Then we said there's 4 ways to darshan how we get to the fact that this pasuk that you get karet for tuma and kodshim is actually the person, and not the person was tameh, and not the object was the food was tameh. And we have 4 pasukim. One of them was Rebbe, where he learned it from the word va'achal, which we didn't really understand what that had anything to do with. Then Rava said, oh, by the way, Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi, he really knows how to explain psukim, and Zeiri really knows how to explain braita. And then he brings the way Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi explained this pasuk, the way that he explained Rebbe's drashot. And then we jump to Zeiri. So what Zeiri is doing is he's going to explain this braita that really is very complicated. And it's actually a similar topic because we're talking about eating items that are kodesh or have some sort of level of kedusha to them while tameh. Okay, this is while the person is tameh. So let's look at the psukim. I brought them in the study guide in Vayikra chapter 22, verses 2 through 9. We're going to read right now. Okay, we're not going to read them completely, but the first pasuk we're actually going to come back to much later in the daf in a totally different sugya. But it basically says, speak to Aaron and his sons and tell him, Vayinazru mi kodshei b'nei Israel, stay far away from kodshei b'nei Israel. In other words, this obviously means if you're impure, really. V'lo yechalalu et shem kodshi asher hem makdishim li. And don't desecrate my name, that they are, right, consecrating to me. Very unclear words. We're going to get back to this. And then tell them basically, okay, and they starts to say, if you yikrav mikol zarachem, if you even get close to the kodashim, okay, which obviously doesn't mean get close to, but you get too close, like by eating, touching, all that. Bitumato alav, and you're tameh, v'nichrita nefesh ha'imi lefanai ani Hashem, right? You're going to get karet. Now, ish mizer Aaron, and then it starts going through. If you're tsarua, mitzora, you're zav. Okay, I'm just reading. I'm not reading it inside, but tameh nefesh, you're tameh made, or you're tameh or shechvat zera, seminal emission, or sheretz. The ones we're going to focus on today are tameh nefesh and sheretz, because those are like at 2 extremes. I mean, you could have used other ones, but the Gemara is going to use those examples. Tameh nefesh is the more severe, tumat made, right? You came in contact with a dead body, or you touched a sheretz, right? Obviously, tameh dead body, it's 7 days. Sheretz is 1 day. Okay, all that. Now, so anyway, you get tameh, and then nefesh asher tigabo v'tme'ad erev. If you touch any of these things and you're tamei till the evening, v'lo yochal min hakodashim. Here comes the lo taseh that the braita was referring to potentially. Okay, don't eat from the kodashim while you're in this tamei status. Ki im rachatz b'sorah b'mayim. You just have to go to the mikvah. It's very confusing because it sounds like all you have to do is go to the mikvah. The next pasuk says, uba hashemesh v'tayer. Well, you're only going to be pure once the sun sets. And then achar yochal min hakodashim. Kilachmo, and then you can eat the kodashim. Now, the way this is understood, because this seems to contradict. Okay, there's a Gemara in Yevamot that talks about this, which is lo yocham min kodashim. This lo tase is talking about if you ate maaser sheni. For maaser sheni, if you're what we call a tvul yom, you went to the mikvah, but you didn't wait yet to the sunset. Okay, and you ate maaser sheni. That's the lo tase lo yocham min kodashim. And then it says, you have to wait for sunset, and only then you can eat. That's truma. Okay? And that's how they distinguish between these 2 psukim. So these psukim relate to someone who's impure, who eats maaser sheni, who eats truma. And then it says at the end, pasuk tet, I'm skipping pasuk chet, v'shemur mishparti, you have to keep protect my important things. V'lo yisu alav chet, you won't get a sin. Umei tubo ki chalaluhu, you will get the death penalty if you desecrate. So now it's also, we got two things going on. There's a lo taseh, which you get lashes for. That's for eating maser sheni. And you get the death penalty, which is really death by the hands of God. It's not death by the court, if you ate truma when you were tamei. So what did we have here? We had this confusing braita that said, why does it mention both the light things and the stringent things? Because, right, if it said one, we could have learned the other. How could we have learned, right? We would have thought, now we're going to try to say, we thought you could have learned that, but you really couldn't have, and that's why it needs to mention both the light ones and the severe ones. So again, let's go through the words. If it had said kalot and nachamulot, hayiti omer, I would have said, ala kalot belav, maybe only the kalot is the lo taseh. Okay, presumably we're talking about velo yochal min hakodashim, okay, which is just a lo taseh, and you would get lashes. And you would have thought the chamulot b'mitah. You would have thought you get the more severe punishment for the most severe items. That's why it says chamulot. Okay, and that's why the chamulot are there to say, no, you only get a lav for them. And that's why we said if we try to punch into this maaser and truma, which it is maaser is kal and truma is more chamor, but it makes no sense, this line, because we said you would have said the kalot, you get a lo taseh, and the chamurot mitah, you do get mitah for truma. We just saw that. So you can't punch in maaser and truma because the line just makes no sense, because you actually do get onesh mavet for truma. And even just that line makes no sense, because if you said the kalot belav, and all that's all that was there, you would have assumed that the chamu won't get mitah, but you can't say that because there's a principle that says dayo labaminadin liot kanidon, which is if you're going to learn one from the other, you can never go more severe. Even if the kal has this law, and then you're going to say the chamor has at least that law, but that law only, you can't go farther and say it must have a more stringent law because it's a more stringent halacha. You can't do that. If you're learning something by logical inference, you can only get to the level of whatever that was. So if you're going to learn the chamurot from the kalot, you'd only get a lav. So that doesn't make sense. That's actually a problem with the braita in general, whether we punch in maaser and truma or not. Okay, now we're going to start 3 lines from the bottom of yesterday's daf and read inside. That was all the review from yesterday. Ela kalot tumat sheretz, chamurot tumat mei. So maybe it's not what you did, it's the tuma that you got. So tumat sheretz is lighter, as I said, and tumat mei is more severe. So now we have to figure out, well, what do you then do? It's just because just becoming tamei isn't going to get you punished. So ibit truma, we're going to do, what if it's truma and what if it's maaser? And neither one's going to work. Because if it's truma, we got 2 problems. Okay, because ibit truma, idi v'idi hu b'mitah. Okay, now, both whether you got tamei sheretz or you got tamei tumat mei, and then you ate truma, you get the death penalty. We just saw that. And this is all talking about, right, that the chamurot and the kalot are both negative prohibitions, right? It's just lashes, not death. So it definitely can't be that. V'tu, and furthermore, lechach ne'amru chamurot belav ha b'mitahu. What did we say? If you would have just said the kalot and not the chamurot, what would you have said? The kalot, you get a lo taseh, but the chamurot, you get onesh mavet. Now, that is actually what you get for truma. So it wouldn't be a question. Okay, so now, Iba, and even the kalot are b'mitah. So that whole line clearly makes no sense. So it can't be that it's the tumat sheretz and the tumat mei that ate truma. Iba chilat maaser, maybe that would work, because that's all lo taseh, and that's really what we're looking for here. But what's the problem here? Okay, I skipped some words because by neither in parentheses. Im lo ne'emru chamurot, hayiti omer ala chamurot b'mitah. Mitumat sheretz ka'atya v'dayo lavo min adin li'ok kanidon. Now, what did it say? If it didn't say the chamurot, what would you have thought? The chamurot b'mitah. Now, how could you, if we're learning it from tumat sheretz, and tumat sheretz, in other words, again, we're going to be tumat sheretz that eats maaser, right? We're going to assume, let's say, right? Remember, this actually would be a good option because both appear in the pasuk and both it's a lo taseh, lo yochal min hakodashim. So it's a lo taseh. But now, this line that I said before doesn't make any sense halachically, because if it had just said it by sheretz and it didn't mention tumat mei here, what would I have said? So the braita claims I would have said, well, it's a lo taseh for eating maaser sheni when you have tumat sheretz. But if you had a more severe tumat mei, I would have thought it was the death penalty. And that's why they had to tell you that also tumat mei is belav. Now that would all be true, but what's the problem? The whole logic of that. If you're going to learn it from sheretz, what did we learn? If you're learning one thing from another, a chamor thing from a kal, you can't learn a more severe punishment. You just can't do that. So you would never have come to that conclusion. So it can't be that either. So this is why this braita is completely confusing, and this is why Rava said, wow, Zeiri saved the day, right? He really knows how to explain these things, because here's going to come Zeiri with a creative interpretation. Amar Zeiri, kalot tumat sheretz chamurot tumat meit. So he does say, the kal that we're talking about is sheretz, the chamur is tumat meit. But what's the problem? Well, and it's still, we have to resolve. So they ate truma, they ate maser sheni, which one? And neither really works. Well, hachi kama, this is what it says. Now, he has to change some of the words of the braita to make this work, but he does like a loose understanding of the words we saw, but there's no way to understand it according to the way it was written. Ilu ne'emar tumat sheretz, v'ne'emar truma u'ma'asel, v'lo ne'emar tumat meit. Now, let's say we had tumat sheretz, and it said maaser and truma. Now, what would that mean? If you're tamei sheretz, now we go back to our psukim. If you ate maaser sheni while you were tamei from the sheretz, it would be a lo taseh, lo yocham min hakodashim, you get lashes. If you ate truma, it would be umetubo kuyachalu. So now we have two laws. So tumat sheretz, which is kal, if you do there's two kals and two chamors, right? Because we have that already. We have our tumat sheretz and maaser, which are both kal, and tumat meit and truma, which are both chamor. So if you take the kal tuma and then you do the kal thing, you get lashes. If you take the kal sheretz and you combine it with the truma and you eat truma, which is chamor, you're going to get the death penalty. So now, what's the logical explanation here? The logical thought that you would have thought had the pasuk not clarified. Hayiti omel kalot ala kalot belav. Right? This is what I just said. If you put kal and kal together, sheretz and maaser, what's going to happen? Lo taseh. Ala chamuro b'mita. But if you put kal with chamor, you're going to get death penalty. So midi kalot chamuro b'mita. Chamurot nami ala kalot b'mita. So now let's go through the tumat meit. Now, if it just said sheretz and it didn't say meit, what conclusion could I have gotten to? If you combine the chumrah of tumat meit with the kula of maaser sheni, meaning someone became tamei tumat meit and ate maaser sheni. Now, according to the Torah, what does it say? It's just a lo taseh. But you might have thought, since sheretz, which combines with, right, when you combine a kal and a chamor, sheretz and truma, you get death, right? Kal plus chamor equals death. So kal and chamor might equal death there too. Tumat meit and maaser get you to death penalty. That's why it says l'chach ne'emru chamurot. That's why the pasuk here says if you're tamei meit or if you're sheretz, it's all the same thing. Lo yocham min hakodashim is a lo taseh and truma is mavet. Okay, and that's how he explains it. So it's this combo of tamei, of kal and chamor and kal and chamor, right? And the real is the combo of kal and chamor. Kal and chamor this way and kal and chamor that way. You might have thought was the same law. It's not. That's why you need to specify that all the tumas are treated the same. It's all a matter of what did you eat. If you ate maaser sheni while you were tamei, any tuma, it's going to be a negative prohibition. That's what it's really trying to say. And obviously, if you ate truma, it's death. But this is really talking about the eating maaser sheni. Okay, that was a little complicated and convoluted, but we finished it. Now we're going to move on back to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said, "Kol sheyesh lo mitirin bein la'adam bein lemizbeach chayavim alav mishum pigul." Now this is the big topic of yesterday, which we said, right? If something has a matir, right? The only thing that can become pigul is something that something else permits it. If it doesn't have the stage before that something permits this, either to be eaten or to be burned on the altar, there's no pigul. Today we're going to see where we get it from. Okay, so to do that, we're going to bring this very long braita, and most of today is going to be dealing with parts of this braita. Okay, I charted out here. I didn't get to chart out everything. I did chart out the first part of the braita, and then a little bit of the discussion the Gemara is going to have on that part after. Tanu Rabbanit. O Yomi vi ela kayotze b'shlamim. Now let's just go back for a minute to the pigul pasuk. Vayikra zayin yuched. At this point, you should know this pasuk, but if not, this is good review. We learned the whole source of pigul from this pasuk. Even though it doesn't really, it says the word pigul, but it's really talking about notar. And we said, well, right, it sounds like you ate it. Right, if you eat from the basar of the zevach of your shlamim beyond the given time, meaning it's notar, it's left over, lo yeratzeh, your korban will not be accepted. Hamakrivo to lo yichashev lo. It will not be, right, with this we had a whole drashot, what this means, hamakrivo to lo yichashev lo. But there we think this has to do with machshava, even though it didn't really seem to, but maybe because of the words lo yichashev. Maybe because how could you disqualify a korban 3 days later, right? Retroactively disqualify it. And we're not exactly right. There were a bunch of reasons as to why this pasuk really isn't talking about notar. In the end, the rabbis take this pasuk out of their context and say, then calls it pigul yihiyeh. This is where we get that only with eating it you get punished, you get the karet. And remember, avono yisa, we learned to notar, where avono yisa, and there it's karet. That's how we know you get karet for this. And right, the main thing is that this isn't talking about actually eating, even though it sounds like it. It's talking about you have a thought that you're going to eat it on the third day. But the main thing here right now is that it says zevach shlamav. It's only for shlamim. So how did we get to other things? So that's the beginning part of this braita. Mashlamim miyuchadim nechalim l'shnei yamim v'layla echad av kol ne'echad l'shnei yamim v'layla echad. So now we're going to say it sounds like maybe it's only bringing what's like shlamim, which is any korban that can be eaten for 2 days and a night, as opposed to most korbanot, which can only be eaten for 1 day and 1 night, right? That's like chatat, asham, pesach, okay, many of them. And what about the ones that can't be eaten at all, like an ola? So maybe this is only coming to include. Later we're going to say this is what would this include? It would include bechor, even though the Gemara doesn't say it. Also includes maaser behema. Those are the only really other korbanot that get eaten for that period of time. So how do we know that other korbanot also are going to have pigul, like if they can be eaten the next day? Talmud lomar mi basal kol sheshayarav nechalim. So now we have other korbanot, as long as some part of it can be eaten, like the chatat and the asham, where the kohen eats the meat, or all those other sacrifices, like Pesach, where the owners eat the meat. That's included from the word. Okay, now we're darshaning the beginning of this pasuk. Mi besar zevach shlamav. So we darshan shlamim. They would only be like shlamim. Mi besar comes to say other korbanot that you can eat the meat of, some of the meat. And ola, and by the way, mincha also, you can eat it would include, I guess, also, the mincha we're going to get later, because that would only include meat. Okay? Ola, she'ein she'erei nechalim minayin. How do we know the ola, though, that has nothing that's permitted to eat? Talmud lomar zevach. Zevach comes to include any kind of sacrifice. Okay, now this would be slaughtering. So this would be only animals. So we now have all animals, not birds, not menachot. Okay, there's pigul by all these things, even if you can't eat the meat. Okay, so what about the birds and the mincha offerings, meal offerings? And even to the extent, even the log shemen of that leper. Okay? This, by the way, is only Rabbi Meir. Remember, Rabbi Meir says that there was a machloket in our mission about the log shemen. We're going to get back to that and deal with it a lot today. So anyway, where do we get those from? Talmud lomar asher he makdishim li. Okay, this is a totally different pasuk. This is where we started today. With the pasuk I said we're going to get back to this, which is actually not in the pigul section. It's in the tameh section. Someone who's tameh, it says, stay away from the kodshe b'nei Yisrael, and don't desecrate my name. Asher he makdishim li. Now what they say is asher he makdishim li is any kind of kodshim, meaning menachot and birds. Okay, now how do we get from that pasuk to our topic? So we take a break in the braita for a minute, and the Gemara tells us, "Va'ate notar chilu mituma, va'ate pigul avon avon mi notar." We're going to have 2 gzeiras here that are going to connect that pasuk to us. That pasuk says, "Lo yechalalu," don't desecrate in tameh. Notar, it says, and here's the pasukim on the sheet: Vayikra, Yud Tet, pasukim vav ad chet, really pasuk chet. Okay, if you want to read vav and zayin, that's notar, right? If you leave it over, you have to burn it. Ve'ochlav avono yisak yekodesh Hashem chilel. So notice the word chilel is there. So from there we get to connect tameh to notar. Now by notar it says avono yisak, and by pigul it says avonat yisak. So the avon connects the 3 of these, and that's why they're always a trio. This pigul, notar, and tameh, because they're all interconnected through these zerot shavot. So therefore we can say that what it says asher he makdishim li in this pasuk with chilul connects to notar, which is chilul, which connects back to pigul because they both say avon, notar and pigul. So from there we get, it's like transitive property kind of thing. So from there we can connect that pasuk, and that pasuk is a very general thing, asher he makdishim li, anything they sanctify to me, which would include those as well. Okay, continuing in the braita. Okay, now I'm shutting this for right now, the share screen, because we don't really need it. Okay, you'll see there's one more side in the chart that includes a few more things that later the Gemara is going to delve into. Okay. Okay. Now we're back to the braita. Now they ask a great question. If in any case we were going to get to all the korbanot, so why did the pasuk say specifically shlamim? Seems a little strange. Me'ata, now here we find, lama ne'emar shlamim me'ata. Why did it say shlamim there? Now, here we get to what we're looking for, which is where we get to this whole matir thing. The shlamim have an action that permits the meat to be burned on the altar, right? Without doing the blood, you can't burn the parts on the altar. And also to Adam. Without burning the parts on the altar, the people can't eat the meat. So it has mitirim, both for Adam and both for Mizbeach. Here, bain means both, and a second bain is going to mean either or, okay? But from here we get to af kol sheyesh lo mitirim ben la'adam ben lemizbeach chayavim alav mishum pigul. So in order for it to be pigul, it has to have those criteria. That's how we get that the pigul has to have something that permits it, because it's like shlamim. Okay, now we're just going to continue, and just like our Mishnah did, we're going to have very similar things to our Mishnah. Ha'ola. Okay, now we're going to show what's the matir in these things and what becomes pigul and what doesn't become pigul. This, by the way, is organized a little better. This starts with what is pigul and then goes to what's not. Our Mishnah was a little strange. It started what's not pigul and then went to what is pigul. Dama matir pesara lemizbeach v'ora lekohanim. So in the ola, the blood, sprinkling of the blood, permits the meat to be burned on the altar and permits the hide to go to the kohanim. Ola ta'of, where there is no hide. So dama, when you sprinkle the blood, matira pesara lemizbeach. That permits the meat to be burned on the altar. Chatat ha'of, in the burnt offering of the bird, dama matira pesara lekohanim. The blood permits the meat to be eaten by the kohanim. Parim anisrafim usirim anisrafim. These are the inner ones, the ones done on the inner altar. Dama matirat imuihem li karet. When you put the blood on the inner altar, that permits the parts that have to be burned on the altar. Just the imurim are burnt, right? Those unique parts of the fats and some of the other things, the kidneys and the lobe of the liver, that permits them to be burned. And then remember, then you take the rest of the animal and you burn it outside Jerusalem. But that permits the imurim to be sacrificed. Umotzi ani et hakometz ve'et halevona v'haktoret. Now, what is not pigul? The kometz, the levona, the ktoret, minchat kohanim, minchat kohen Mashiach, minchat nesachim, v'hadam. Okay, I'm not going to go through all these. We saw these yesterday. Okay, these are out. Now, Rabbi Shimon Omer, mashlamim. Now, here's Rabbi Shimon that we also saw in our Mishnah. Mashlamim yuchadim sheyesh bo hamizbeach hachitzon v'chayavin alav, af kol sheyesh dam hamizbeach hachitzon v'chayavin alav mishum pigul. Again, he makes a comparison to shlamim. Now he says, pigul is only in things that are similar to shlamim in the sense that they're brought on the outer altar. Not the ones that are brought on the inner altar. There's no pigul at all by parim, hanisrafim, and sirim, and nisrafim, by those chatad ot apnimiyot, par kohen Mashiach, sa'ir yom kippurim, par yom kippurim, all those. None of that. Yatsu parim and nisrafim, usirim and nisrafim, ho'il she'en al mizbeach hachitzon kishlamim, en chavim alehem mishum pigul. So there's not going to be pigul for them. Okay. So now they want to know a few short things till we get to like the more in-depth part of the sugya. Kayotze b'shlamim ma'inihu. When it says at the very first line, maybe it's only things that are eaten for 2 days and a night. What is that? Bechor. So here the firstborn animal has to be sacrificed, and that is eaten in the same as shlamim. Now they're going to say, well, how would you have learned from one to the other? But my ate, what mechanism would you have used? If you would use iba mematzinu, if you would use the paradigm, okay, it says it here, so we'll say the same things there because it has the same criteria. But it doesn't have the same criteria. It doesn't have the same rules. So you wouldn't have been able to do that. Why? Ikalamifrach, you could say, malish shlamim, there's a chumrah by shlamim, so maybe pigul is only by the more severe, by the more stringent one. Shehein tiunim smicha u'nisachim u'tinfach hazevashah. The shlamim needs smicha, okay, all these things aren't by bechor. You have to bring nisachim libations with them, and you have to wave the chazeh, the breast, and the thigh. That doesn't happen by bechor. So you wouldn't say we could build a paradigm because it's not really the same. Ela mi'im ha'chol yachel. Maybe you learn it from im ha'chol yachel. That's what we're going to learn it. Why? So they don't really say this, but it's clear from the next line what they mean. There's a klal u'prat u'klal. If you remember the way klal u'prat u'klal works, if you have a klal and a prat and a klal, then we're going to include all sorts of things that are similar enough to the prat. It doesn't have to be so similar, but if you have, again, general, then you go specific, then you get general. Then the general at the end comes to say, well, take the prat and say anything sort of like it. So then we could get to bechor. What's the klal u'prat u'klal? Good question. Well, it says ha'chol yachel, and then it says shlamim. Shlamim is the prat. Ha'achol, you eat anything, so to speak. Yachel, also anything. It's a bit of a weird klal u'prat klal. It's a klal u'prat. It's not a klal u'prat klal, but they try to say this is a klal u'prat klal. So the Gemara then asks, Hane tre klale dismicha adadinidu. That's klal prat. That's not klal u'prat klal. So Amarava kedamar maravi, like they say in Israel, kol makom shatam would say shnei klalot asmuchin zelazeh hatel proper nehem v'duna b'klal u'prat. In Israel, their approach was, if you have a klal and prat, you view it as if the klal was at the end. And you can do a klal prat klal in this way, and that's how they say we could have learned from shlamim to bechor through this klal prat klal method. Okay. Now we go to the more complicated part. Ad shani marbeh log shemen shel mitzorah. Hamane Rabbi Meir he. So now we're going to have a problem. And I kind of read it quickly, this other part of the Mishnah, the braita. But now we're going to see that there's really a problem in the braita. Because the braita starts off saying, not starts, but in the middle it says, the log shemen of the mitzorah is also, right, when it did all those drashot, where is their pigul? Also in the log shemen. Now, let's go back to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah had two debates, okay? And I want to explain them a little more clearly today, particularly in light of what we're going to do with them today. There were two debates that Rabbi Meir disagreed with the rabbis. One was about the nisachim and one was about the log shemen. And he said that both the nisachim, the libations that go with the offering, which could be a meal offering, could be a meal libation, it could be the wine pouring, you pour the wine on the altar. Those, he said, there's pigul. And the rabbi said there isn't pigul. Now, when he said there's pigul, you have to be very clear now what he meant. What he meant is, and we specifically said it because he said it's only nisachim that go with, right, that go with the korban, okay? Whereas the Chachamim said, even if they go with the korban, there's no pigul, okay? He said, if they're Rabbi Meir said, if the nisachim are by themselves, meaning you bring them a few days later, we'll see today you can bring them up to 10 days after. If you bring them separately, there's no pigul. If you do them together with the offering, there's pigul. And he also said about the log shemen shel mitzorah, because the blood of the asham permits it. Now, what does that mean? What it means is, he views these as interconnected. When you bring your libations with the offering, the sacrifice, and you have a pigul thought about the offering, like while you're doing the blood, you think I'm going to eat the meat beyond its given time, that makes the libations go together with it. So whatever happens pigul on the meat, it's going to affect the libations as well, assuming that you sacrificed it that day. If you sacrifice it separately, then no. Same with the log shemen of the mitzorah. If you have a pigul machshava about that blood of the asham and you were sprinkling it and thought, oh, I'm going to eat the meat after the given time, so that makes the sacrifice pigul, and likewise the oil will go along with that. That's the way we understood it yesterday. Okay, that's pigul according to Rabbi Meir, and the rabbis say because the log shemen could be done separately. And because the nisachim, the libations could be brought, they could all be brought a different day and done separately, a different time. They're not integrally connected. So you make the korban pigul, it doesn't affect that. That's how we understand the log shemen is pigul, because a pigul machshava about the meat, right, and the animal, like while you're slaughtering it, you had a pigul thought at any stage of the animal. This just goes along with it. It's a corollary of it. So now the problem is, very simply, the braita says, log shemen of mitzorah, there's pigul, chayavim mishum pigul, and that must be Rabbi Meir, but ema seifa, but then the braita also said, and I kind of went over this quickly, motzi anim and chat nisachim v'hadam. Of the exceptions to the rule where there's no pigul, it says the nisachim, the libations. Well, then that is atan l'Rabbanit, because Rabbi Meir thinks the libations could become pigul. So now we have one part of the braita is Rabbi Meir, the other part is the rabbis. That can't be. So now they say the following. Titania. Okay, first we're going to see how do we know it's the rabbis. And we're going to, again, this is going to be a repeat of what I explained to you, and you'll see it more inside now. Titania. Niske behema chayavim alehem mishum pigul. Mipnei shedama zevach mitiran likarev divrei Rabbi Meir. Here we're going to see it explicitly. It didn't say this is explicit in our Mishnah, but here it says it very clearly. The nisachim that go with the animal, the libations that go with the animal, you're chayav mishum pigul, because the blood of the zevach permits them to be sacrificed. So therefore, pigul in the animal, right? Since the blood, since it's integrally connected, the blood permits the nisachim. You can't bring the nisachim before you do the blood. Therefore, it's a matir, and therefore, if something happens to them, then these become pigul. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Amrula, the rabbi said, Balo adam v'yitzivcha hayom u'nisachim mikam v'asara yamim. You could bring your korban today and your nisachim you could bring up to 10 days later. So you can't possibly say that a pigul thought in the blood, it might permit it to be going, but you could do it. It's completely separate. So just because the meat becomes pigul doesn't mean this is going to become pigul, the nisachim, which again could be the wine libation, it could be the meal offerings, right? All those. Amar lahen, Rabbi Meir says that. I only meant when you do it the same day. And here's what I said before. This is explicit. I only meant when you bring it together. Okay, and that also was clear in the Mishnah because he said, right, there's b'im b'fnei atzman and there's b'im ma'beima. Okay, so he basically says, I didn't mean if you separate it. I only meant if they're together. And the rabbis' approach is, well, since they can be separated, even when you do it together, we don't view them as one unit. So now we have this contradiction because if you say about the log shemen, we're assuming it's the same machloket. We're going to say about the nisachim, either they're both pigul or neither is pigul. So Amar Rav Yosef, Hamane Rebbe. Rav Yosef says, oh, don't worry, this is Rebbe, by the way, right? Often you have something. So this braita is Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and he said to Amar, now we're going to bring something Rebbe says in a completely different well, not completely, but different context. He's not talking about pigul. This is what's important, and don't get confused. What he's talking about is that there's something that permits something else. Now, until now, what did we think pigul was? Your thought was when you were doing the blood, right, slaughtering or some part of the blood of the damasham, sprinkling it, you had a thought about eating the meat later, and then that affected the log shemen because that all just goes together with it. That was Rabbi Meir's approach. According to Rav Yosef, Rebbe, he thinks, has a different approach. Now, later they're going to say this is not what Rebbe said, and you're wrong for thinking this. But at least Rabbi Yomi is going to disagree. He said, Log shemen shel matzorah matnotav sharule. Umidamatnotav sharile matnotav mefaglele. He says it's not the blood and the dealing with the blood that's going to cause it to become pigul. When you do the oil, let's go through again what happens. After you finish with all the blood, where you put the blood on the altar, and then you put the blood on the ear and the nose and the ear and the finger and the toe of the leper, then you move to the oil. And the Kohen takes a log of oil, puts his hand in it, okay, takes oil out, and then he's going to do all sorts of things with this oil. What's left is the remainder, whatever's left in the bottle, the jug that he didn't take, or the vessel, that goes to the Kohanim to eat, okay? That's the first thing you have to understand. And what does he do with the oil? He sprinkles it toward Kodesh Kodeshim. Okay. Then, according to the Torah, it's toward Oil Moed. Then he takes the oil and he puts it on the ear and the nose and the ear and the finger and the toe of the leper. Then he takes the rest. He smears it on the top of the head of the leper. But what's left in that jug that he didn't take from the first place, it's like the komets, goes to the Kohanim. So now comes Rebbe and says, the sprinkling of the oil permits okay, now, he's talking about the laws of Me'ilah. What is Me'ilah? Misuse of consecrated property. Now, at some point, this oil will become permitted to the Kohen, right? Because the Kohen can eat the rest of the oil. So, and at some point, it's forbidden to the Kohen. At what point does it become permitted to the Kohen? Like from a Torah perspective, not from a real perspective, because in the end, the rabbis were strict. But from a Torah perspective, there's this machloket, which we're going to see in a minute. But Rebbe weighs in on that machloket and says, when you sprinkle the oil, the 7 sprinklings of the oil, that permits the me'ilah. That removes the me'ilah from the oil. So if somebody at that point, even though you haven't finished everything, were to take the oil and eat it right then, they wouldn't be liable for misuse of consecrated property. So now he says, it's a matir. The oil, now this is not the blood, right? This is the oil of itself. The oil matirs itself. Okay? So midamatnotav sharule, when you sprinkle that oil, it permits the shirayim. Matnotav mefaglele. So maybe we're going to say it's not the blood of the asham. There's a third opinion. And then this third opinion can fit in our mission. Then we don't have this problem. This is Rabbi Meir, that's the rabbis. We say this is Rebbe, and that's Rabbi Meir. That's okay. They don't argue really. So he says the matnotav mefaglele. That permits causes pigul. Now, Tanya, how do we know that he holds this way? Now we're going to see it inside. First, we're going to see the dissenting opinion. Log shemen. By the way, sorry, my mistake. Then it would be Rebbe is the log shemen, and the rabbis are the nisachim, and they don't contradict because the rabbis disagree with Rabbi Meir, but there was no machloket Rebbe and the rabbis about the nisachim. This is unique to the shemen of the Metzora. So then the first part of the braita is Rebbe, the second part is the rabbis, and they fit together. It's not a problem. So now we're going to see this machloket. Log shemen shel Metzora moalim bo ad shizrok hadam. According to the rabbis, so actually the me'ilah is removed at a much earlier stage. When you sprinkle the blood of the korban asham, of the Metzora, already the oil's permitted. Now, only on a Torah level. The rabbis, of course, forbid it, and that's the next line. Nizrach adam lo nehenim. Okay, you still can't benefit from it, but lo moalim. But there's no Torah law of me'ilah. Because as soon as you sprinkle the blood, it's as if, what do we learn always? The sprinkling of the blood is like the end game, right? Everything else is like, an extra. Now, it has to be done, this part, but the me'ilah is already removed from the oil. Rabbi Omer, no, it's not from the zrikatam. Moalim ad shitei matnotav. Now, shavin, they both agree. Shasur b'achila, just so you know. They all think you can't eat it yet, okay? It's a prohibition to eat it. Ad shitei matan sheva matan bo. No, you have to first put the oil, sprinkle it 7 times. Then you have to put it on the behonot, on the finger and the ear and the toe. Okay. But the point is, he views the oil, the sprinkling of the oil as a matir. So now comes Rabbi Yosef and says, that log shemen and Metzora in this braita must be his position, just like he says it by me'ilah, he's also going to say it by pigul. Amru akamed Rabbi Yirmiyah. They brought Rabbi Yosef's words to Rabbi Yirmiyah, who's in Israel, if you remember. Amar, Gavra Rabba ki Rabbi Yosef lema ki amilta. Such a prominent person like Rabbi Yosef said just a ridiculous thing. Can't possibly be. Here's our classic Rabbi Yirmiyah, ksat chutzpan, right? He's a little bit of a chutzpahdik guy. Turning now to Amud Bet. He says, I'm going to prove to you that there's no way there's a connection between these machlokot, okay? What you say for me'ilah cannot be also the same thing for pigul, because listen to this. Harei log haba b'fnei atzmo. Let's say you bring the log shemen the next day, okay? Now remember, what did we say? This machloket Rabbi Meir and the rabbis was all based on if you did it that day, but everyone agrees that if you did it the next day, for sure, now that's what we're going to see. Now everybody agrees that, right, either the zrikat dam from yesterday or the matanot are going to, right now here, everyone agrees that the matanot are going to remove the me'ilah. At least by then the me'ilah is off. But lo mefaglane, but there's no pigul. Nobody thinks there's pigul there. How do we know? Detanya. Log shemen shel Metzora, chayavim alav mishum pigul, mipnei shedam mitiro lebahonot, divrei Rabbi Meir. Now, remember this machloket Rabbi Meir and the rabbis. We're now going to see exactly what they said by the Nisachim, where they really spelled it out. They're going to spell it out by the log shemen. Now, listen to what he says. If you have a log of Metzora, you chayv mishum pigul. Why? Because the blood permits it for, right, the bohanot, permits the oil to be done. Amrula Rabbi Meir, and that's why these are integrally connected, and that's why pigul for the blood, for the meat, right, is going to cause pigul also to the log. Amrula Rabbi Meir, and the rabbi said, but you can bring your log shemen up to 10 days, just like the libations. Amar lahen, afani lo amarti ele bebayim hasham. Here's the key line. Rabbi Meir says, I only said the log shemen can be pigul if you bring it on the same day with the asham. What do you see here? They all agree that if you bring the log on its own, right? Now, what would Rebbe say if you bring the log on its own 5 days, 10 days later? The oil permits, right? Removes, when you sprinkle the oil, that removes the me'ilah. But nobody in this machloket, is there pigul by log shemen or not? Nobody thinks there's going to be pigul in that case. They all, Rabbi Meir, who's the one who says, oh, there is pigul, he only says it when you do it on the same day. So clearly, we're not talking about that a thought when you sprinkle the oil is going to cause pigul to the oil. No. The only kind of pigul you could really have is pigul on the meat, on the animal, and then you could say, oh, maybe the log shemen is integrally connected. So this new way of thinking about it that Rav Yosef proposes, Rav Yirmiyah says is ridiculous. Okay, and there's no way it could be true. So comes Rabbi Yirmiyah at least with his own explanation. He's not just knocking someone else, but it's always nice to see that in the Gemara, right? Unfortunately, in other things in life, we always see people just knock out other opinions, but don't necessarily have their own solution. One loves to just be a critic, but he comes up with his own. El Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah la'olam Rabbi Meir he. Bismei mikan nisachim. We'll explain this braita as Rabbi Meir because he says the log of shemen is pigul, and that's because the dam ha'asham mitiro, right, has the matir of the blood. It's integrally connected. If it's done on the same day, obviously. And Just get rid of the words nisachim. It got in there by accident. It shouldn't be there. Take it out. And then the whole thing matches Rabbi Meir. It's an easy solution, but obviously requires editing, which we prefer not to do if we can avoid it. So Amar Abaye, La'olam lo tisame. Don't delete that word. I can explain it in a different way. Now, if you remember, let's just go back before we say this. The log and the nisachim. According to Rabbi Meir, there's pigul for them. But when? Only if they're brought on the same day as the sacrifice. And both theoretically could be brought later. So here's Abaye's creative answer. When it says log habayim asham, tani log habayim asham, okay, when it says log, it meant the log that comes with the asham. That's obvious, right? On the same day. Vihu adin l'nisachim habayim im hazevach. And by the way, when it said log shemen shel metzora, it would include, by the way, if you remember, it even said until you get to that, like even that, which includes anything that's like that, which is the libations that come with the sacrifice. And when it said later, hadar tani nisachim, it meant nisachim ab'im b'fnei atzmam. V'uadin l'log haba b'fnei atzmo. And when it said log, it meant anything that goes with the korban, the log and the nisachim, if they're done on the same day. Then there's pigul. Because if you're pigul, fagal the korban, that will be pigul. And when it said nisachim, there's no pigul, he meant nisachim that are done on their own, separately, 5 days, 10 days later. Just like you can include in that the log that's done 5 or 10 days later. And then there's no pigul because it's already disconnected from the korban. And that's a good creative way to explain the Mishnah, the braita. Okay? And with that, we finish this section. So there are 3 attempts to resolve it, although one of them got pretty much knocked out of there. Now we're on another line of the braita. So now we want to know, and for this we're going to bring a long braita, which is actually a pretty simple braita, but a long braita, darshaning one pasuk. How do we know that the kohanim are allowed to eat the meat of the chatat ha'of? And then we're going to have to see why was it a chiddush that you had to explain it? Like, why wouldn't it be obvious? But there's a pasuk that talks about the matnot kehuna. It's in Bamidbar Yud Chet, pasuk tet. This is what you're going to get as kohanim. Min ha'esh, from things that go on the fire. Kol korbanam, all their korbanot. L'chol min chatam, all their minachot. L'chol, or for all their chatatam, their sin offerings. U'l'chol hashamam. Notice the word l'kol appears. All their. We're going to darshan every single one of these kol. Why is that word added? Asher yashivu li, that they will return to me. Kodesh kodeshim l'cha, will be sanctified to you. U'levanecha, and your sons. So now we want to darshan what all this is. Menane milei. Ditani Levi says, Kol korbanan, and we're going to learn all sorts of other things here besides. L'rabot log shemen shel metzora. Okay, how do we know that the log shemen, all the one that's left there in the jug or in the vessel that they had the oil in before the Kohen took some from there? How do we know it goes to the Kohen? Salkadata, because of the word Kol korbanam, all. Now, each time we're going to have a drashot, we're going to have to say, well, why wasn't it obvious? You would have thought, mina esh katarachman. It said from the fire, meaning something has to go on the fire and then you get the rest of it, whatever didn't go on the fire. And nothing of the oil went on the fire, wasn't burned. So high lav motar mina eshu, this isn't left over from something that went on the fire, kamashmalan. That's why it needed special inclusion. L'chol min chatam. So what mincha? Now, in general, what happens? The Kohen takes the kmitza, burns it. The rest of it goes on the rest of it goes to the Kohen. So what do you need an extra pasuk for? What's this adding besides those? L'rabot minchat omer u'minchat akno. The one that goes, the mincha offering that goes with the korban omer, and the one that goes with the sota. Okay, again, why are those any different? Sal kadat chamina. Again, this is the remainder, what doesn't get burned. Sal kadat chamina. You would have thought there's a different pasuk in Shmo Kaftet, which talks about what the kohanim get. Va'achlu otam, you can eat them asher kupar b'hem, because atonement was achieved through them. Now these are not atonement minachot. Minchat omer lahatir atia. It comes to permit the new crop, the new season of the wheat. Uminchat knaot levarer avon katia. And the minchat knaot comes to determine, was she a sota or was she not? It's not to atone for anyone. So you might have thought maybe the Kohen doesn't get them because he only gets things that there was atonement associated with it. Kamash malan. That's why we needed a drashot. L'chol chatatam. Now we finally get to what we were looking for. If you remember, the chatat of, how do we know the Kohen gets to eat the meat? L'rabot chatat of. All their sin offerings, even the bird ones. Now, why would you have thought not? Well, salkadat chamina nevelahi. You might have thought it's a nevela. Why is it a nevela? Because you don't do shrita on it. Anything that's not slaughtered properly is not permitted to eat outside the temple. But in the temple, we don't do shrita, we do malika on birds, which is the Kohen takes the finger, puts it at the back of the neck, and kills the bird like that. She might have thought maybe that's called a nevela and you can't eat it. It would be a nevela if you did it outside the temple. That's why it says no. Kohen's allowed to eat it because specifically that's like shchita in the temple. L'chol hashamam, l'rabot hasham nazir b'asham tzorah. So why need a special drashot for the asham tzorah and the asham nazir? Salkadat achamina lahachshir ka'atu kamash malan. Likewise, from before, they're not for atonement. What are they for? To permit, right, to finish a process, basically, to allow that person to not be a nazir anymore, to allow that person to not be considered a leper. So maybe you would have thought the Kohen can't eat it. That's why it comes to teach. To which the Gemara asks the question. It says it explicitly. What does it say? Rashi tells us, Ki kachatat ashamhu. In the section of Torah, it says, this asham is just like a chatat. Now, a chatat, the Kohen eats the meat, so of course the asham, you eat the meat. You don't need a drashot for that. So they say, okay, fine. It means, l'rabot asham nazir ki asham mitzorah. Okay, by the asham nazir, it doesn't say that. So it wants to tell you the asham nazir is just like the asham mitzorah, where it says it explicitly, even though there's no atonement. Therefore, we're going to learn from here also to the asham nazir. Asher yashivu ze gezel ager. If somebody steals from a convert and doesn't return it before the convert dies, and then there's no heirs, what do? It goes to the Kohen. And that's Asher Yashivu, that will be returned. That's what we're talking about, returning a stolen item. Lichahu, we're just at the end of the pasuk now. You can do anything you want with all these gifts. These gifts are not God's anymore. They're yours. They're not sanctified. You can go betroth a woman with it. Give her that, right? You can use it for anything you want. You go use it in the store, buy something, right? Anything you want, you could do with it. Okay, Tanya, last point for today. The end of the Mishnah brought this opinion of Rabbi Shimon, and both the braita also, but really we're going back to the Mishnah at this point. That was, until now, we've really almost the whole daf, other than finishing that braita of Zeiri, was all this braita, which we brought for one reason. Why? To say, how do we know that it has to be davar sheyesh lo mitirin, bein la'adam, bein le'mizbeach, and we learned that from the word shlamim. Okay, but we learned a lot of other things in this braita as well, and including we had this whole struggle. Is it Rabbi Meir? I'm just doing the review right now. Is it Rabbi Meir? Is it, right? And then the other part's not Rabbi Meir. How do we resolve that? We had 3 resolutions. One was rejected. We wanted to know about the chatat of. How do you know you're allowed to eat it? For that, we brought this long braita, which showed us all sorts of other things. And we got off on a lot of tangents. Now we're back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Rabbi Shimon says, there's no pigul for, and we also saw it in the braita, for the chataot pnimiyot. And the rabbi said there is. Now we have this in-between position. Tanya, Rabbi Elazar Omer, Mishum Rabbi Yossi. It says Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Most people take out Rabbi Yossi Aglili. It's just Rabbi Yossi. Pigel b'davar nasa b'chutz pigel. B'davar nasa b'fnim lo pigel. It's not so clear what this means exactly, but we'll explain in a minute. If you do pigul on something that's done outside, it's pigul. But if you have pigul on something that's done inside, it's not pigul. So he's going to differentiate between things that are done inside and things that are done outside, but not like Rabbi Shimon and say there's no pigul at all for the things that are brought inside. But he's going to say the following. Ketzad. Let's explain. Haya ome b'chutz v'amar. And let me just say it in simple words. In order for it to be pigul, for the chataot pnimiyot, you have to have done the action when you have the pigul thought outside. Like, let's talk about what happens outside. Slaughtering, collecting the blood, walking is partially outside, partially inside, because you have to walk it inside. And then you do the sprinkling of the blood inside. So if you have a thought while you're doing sprinkling of the blood, not pigul, because you're inside. But if you have a thought while you're doing the slaughtering or the accepting of the blood or the walking in outside, then it can be pigul under another condition, that the thought you're having doesn't have to do with, let's say, I'm going to place the blood tomorrow on the inner altar. No, has to also be a thought about something that's going to happen outside. Like, for example, I'm going to burn the imurim tomorrow. That would be something that happens outside. Okay, so everything about the pigul for the chataot pnimiyot has to be the action you're doing has to be outside, and the thought about what you're going to mess up, it has to be about something outside. It's pretty simple. So let's read it. So they're just going to give examples. It's going to make it very clear. If you're standing outside, that means in the azara. I'm slaughtering in order to sprinkle the blood tomorrow. Lo pigel, because the blood's going to be sprinkled in the inner altar. Because a thought outside about something going on inside is not pigul. If you were inside and you said, I'm sprinkling in order to burn the, right, you're inside, and you say, I'm sprinkling right now inside. Not going to be pigul because you're inside. About doing something outside, burning the imurim or pouring the extra blood outside on the altar, lo pigel. Because this is a machshava inside about something done outside. But here's the case. I'm slaughtering now outside in order to sprinkle pour the extra blood into the base of the altar outside, or to burn the imurim tomorrow. pigul shemachshava b'chutz b'davar nasa b'chutz. And we'll just finish with Amar Rabbi Yishua ben Levi Vayikra. Where do we get it from? Shiur yuram mishor zevach hashlamim. Okay, this is in the middle of the chatat pnimit of the Kohen Mashiach that brings his korban for a sin, mistaken sin. It says, just like you burn these parts on the altar, just like these parts get burned in the shlamim. They asked, Rabbi Yishua ben Levi said, why are you bringing shlamim in the middle of this section of the chatat pnimiyot? Ela makish par Kohen Mashiach l'shor zevach hashlamim. Mashor zevach hashlamim ad shiu ma'asav u'machshavotav u'mizbeach hachitzon. Av par Kohen Mashiach ad shiu machshavotav u'ma'asav u'mizbeach hachitzon. Has to be treated like a shlamim. Just like, in other words, and now, when we hear shlamim, what do we think of? Pigul, because that's the pasuk about pigul, is about shlamim. So it has to be that if you're going to mifagel the korban, has to be like a shlamim, that both the actions are done outside, because nothing of the shlamim is done inside, and the thoughts are done about something outside. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.